I would now like to have Walt Woodward to come up and present the burning question of Nathan Hale for the Hartland Historical Society's 2025 spring meeting presentation. And Walt, we welcome you back here. We all so enjoyed your Charter Oak story the last time you were here, so
thank you.
We're looking forward to it.
Thanks much. And thank you all for coming out. It's nice to see you here, and it was wonderful to hear how engaged and active you are in support of the community. And I have the pleasure to speak to many historical societies around the state and in other places, and I will tell you, the ones who have as many events and are as engaged into the life of their communities as you are few and far between. Everyone wants to, but it takes a special person like Joanne and special people to help her to make this happen, and it's wonderful to hear about. I am, as the sign says, a recovering university professor, and I had the honor to be the state historian of Connecticut from 2004 until 2021 or 2 when I retired. I've been retired so long now I don't even remember when I did. That's a great sign. I want to talk today about Connecticut's state hero, Nathan Hale. He's one of two we have. He's our male state hero. Prudence Crandall is our female state hero. And I want to talk about something that most people don't know about Nathan Hale, which I called the burning questions about him. And you'll see why as the story goes on. So let me just launch right into it. Interestingly, this is a story that has a very direct connection to Hartland, which I'll also tell you about. Let's get started. Each of us has lived through some of them. Some of us have lived through many of them. They're events of such profound impact that they're seared into our memories the instant we hear about them. They change our world, and the very news of their occurrence changes us. Ever after, we connect such events with the moment when and the place where we learned about them. Where were you when John F. Kennedy was assassinated? Where were you when the Challenger exploded? Where were you when Bobby Kennedy died? When Martin Luther King was shot? When the wall came down? Somewhere were you moments hit harder because they hit so close to home. More recently, Newtown was one of those moments. And before that, that awful morning in New York that has permanently changed the way we think about the date, September 11. For on that date, 9/11, every year for the rest of our lives, I hope and I think that each of us will relive our experience of that morning in 2001, when nearly 3,000 of our fellow Americans died. It was a day filled with horror and with heroism. And I know that on that date, you, like me, give special thought to the 411 heroes, 343 firefighters, 60 police officers, and 8 paramedics who marched up those flights of stairs and died trying to save their fellow countrymen. That's a crucible of heroism we owe it to them never to forget. But today I want to talk about another fire and a different hero whose story had a remarkable parallel to 9/11. I'm talking, of course, about that 21-year-old Connecticut and our state hero, Nathan Hale, who gave his life for his country 249 years ago this September. Now, academic historians like me, or like I was, I have to note, in the pursuit of our craft have not generally been kind to heroes. That's because creating heroes and crafting histories are often at odds. Scholars practicing their learned specialties are generally more interested in approaching sources critically rather than reverentially, let the chips fall where they may. The results haven't always been pretty. Often, as historians have clarified historical details, they've also called into question, or at least complicated, older heroic narratives. So it is with Nathan Hale. The last decade has seen a substantial new output of writing about Nathan Hale, and the major impetus behind all this new work was the acquisition in 2003 by the Library of Congress in Washington of a manuscript history of the American Revolution written by a Connecticut storekeeper from Hartland named Consider Tiffany. Tiffany was, without a doubt, one of early Hartland's most prominent and accomplished settlers. In addition to his extensive activities as a merchant, he was a farmer, a sometime schoolmaster, a part-time astronomer, and a writer on many subjects, ranging from his experience as a soldier in the French and Indian War to the astronomical fees charged by Connecticut lawyers. He actually wrote a long poem about fees charged by lawyers. It's pretty funny, and they do it just that way today, I might add. He had, especially for a man living on what was then sort of the Connecticut frontier, an extensive personal library consisting of 64 books. That was a lot of books back then, mostly religious books promoting the principles of the Anglican faith to which he rigorously adhered. In 1778, he built this house, whose image, shown here, was drawn by one of his descendants. He is also noted, among other things, for planting this elm tree to shade his well. The lofty elm grew to have a trunk 21 feet in circumference and spread its branches 105 feet out from the base. It was a big tree. And it is the tree depicted today on the Hartland town seal. An active man with an active mind, Tiffany found himself during the American Revolution with a surprising amount of time on his hands, and he decided to use that time to write a real-time, as-it-happened history of the American Revolution. Now, Tiffany's multi-chapter pen and ink history of the war provided a previously unknown account of Nathan Hale's arrest as a spy in 1776, and that account corroborated some prior evidence, and it supplemented other sources, but overall, it cast our state's hero in a whole new light. Tiffany confirmed, for example, reports that the person who exposed Hale as a spy was the famed Robert Rogers and not Hale's loyalist cousin Samuel, as some sources had suggested. Rogers, by the way, was the founder of Rogers Rangers, the crack colonial militia units whose unconventional bushfighting tactics made them the elite fighting units of the French and Indian War, and the recognized progenitor of today's Army Special Forces. One of the reasons Rogers, who was very much a hero to the people of Connecticut and all of the colonies during the French and Indian War and after, well, one of the reasons he's less well known today is because during the American Revolution, he sided with the king. When Nathan Hale was traversing Long Island seeking intelligence for George Washington, Rogers was there recruiting Redcoat Rangers. In Tiffany's account of Hale's capture, Rogers, seeing Hale and thinking he might be a spy, a Patriot spy, began to shadow him. He disguised himself as a Patriot sympathizer too, Rogers did, and he befriended Hale at a tavern. Rogers conspicuously drank a toast to Congress, and he won the youthful Hale into his confidence by subtly indicating that he, Rogers, was really doing undercover surveillance for the Patriots on Long Island. Well, this gave Hale confidence, and it led him to disclose his own secret mission of spying for Washington. At a second meeting that was arranged by Rogers, Hale again was enticed to talk about his intelligence gathering activities. Rogers listened to him. He let him spin out all the rope he needed to spin out. Then he stood up, revealed his true identity, called up a company of British troops he had standing by, and arrested Hale as a spy. At this point, Tiffany tells us, Nathan Hale acted like anything but a hero, denying his name and the business he came upon. He continued vehemently denying his name and spying activities all the way to the New York headquarters of British Commander William Howe. But there, Tiffany noted, several persons recognized him and they called him by name, upon which he was hanged as a spy without the benefit of a court-martial. Tiffany's account of Hale's panicky effort to save his skin certainly contrasts with the story given by William Hull, Hale's friend and fellow American officer. There you go, that's William Hull. His friend and fellow American officer. Hull reported that upon being arrested, Hale immediately declared his name, his rank in the American Army, and his object in coming within British lines. No panic, no denials. He was a patriot through and through. Hull's story insisted that Hale continued to display the same kind of manly composure and fortitude right up to the gallows, where he supposedly said, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." Now, clearly, both Consider Tiffany's story and William Hull's story both can't be right. And in fact, it's most likely that neither of these two stories is completely right. Mary Beth Baker, who's written a considered analysis of both these primary Hale sources and their authors, points out that neither Consider Tiffany nor William Hull were actual eyewitnesses to Nathan Hale's arrest or execution, and that their accounts are at best based on hearsay evidence. So somebody told me, so I'm telling you. Moreover, she calls our attention to the fact that each of these authors had a very strong personal agenda that influenced their accounts. Tiffany, who penned his account of Nathan Hale more than a decade after Hale's death, had actually been under house arrest in Connecticut's Northwest Hills at the time of Hale's capture, on account of his being a completely unregenerate loyalist, loyal to the king, proud of it, and damned if he was going to change for any patriots out there, so-called patriots. There's a great story. I love, there's a letter that he wrote. Now, this tells you about Consider Tiffany's character. After a year and a half under house arrest, the Committee of Safety, who were the local patriot enforcers, in every town there was a Committee of Safety who made sure that you were doing what you were supposed to do. Well, they decided that a year and a half had been enough for Consider Tiffany to be under house arrest, so without asking him if he wanted to be, they decided they were going to let him go. He heard about it, and he wrote a letter he addressed to the supposed Committee of Safety. And he said, "I understand that without asking my permission, you are about to release me from house arrest. I can only figure I'm paraphrasing now. He says, I can only figure that's for one of two reasons. The first is that you feel so guilty about charging me for unjust reasons that in your shame you've decided to say you're sorry and let me go. The other, this is probably it, the other is that you want me to be free so you can draft me into your army. Well, let me say this. Be that as it may, if I'm put into the army, I will fight for the side that I believe in. And I will fight, and I hate to have to kill, but I will kill for the king I serve." It's great. It's a wonderful letter. And, you know, you can imagine, just put yourself in that position. What kind of courage does it take after a year and a half under house arrest to say, you're going to set me free? Fine, but I'm not going to change. an admirable man, even if he was on the wrong side. So, that's my sidebar about Consider Tiffany. Joanne, by the way, I hope, we talked about doing this, and I hope you will, add to the Consider Tiffany story in the newsletters, because he's an important figure, and he's one we are very fortunate to be able to know a lot about, because he left a lot in writing behind him. Well, back to Nathan Hale. Tiffany, who penned his account of Nathan Hale more than a decade after Hale's death, had actually been under house arrest in Connecticut's Northwest Hills, accused rightly of being a loyalist. In fact, Tiffany's manuscript history of the Revolution, the one in which the Hale story appears, was a diatribe against the American cause and a prophetic Jeremiad is one of these laments, complete with supernatural portents that predicted the impending collapse of what he happily called the disunited States. It was that rarest of all things, a history written by the losers, and it reflected in its tone and text the bitterness of the defeated, or at least the attitude of people who know they're on the losing side but believe they're right. William Hull, whose stirring account of Hale's selfless valor is the bedrock document of Hale's heroic reputation, was, unlike Consider Tiffany, very much a patriot through and through. Perhaps Hale's closest friend in the military, Hull earned his own reputation for bravery in the battles of White Plains, Trenton, Princeton, Stillwater, Saratoga, Fort Stanwix, Monmouth, and Stony Point. He was honored by both Washington and Congress, and in 1805, he became the governor of the Michigan Territory, and again, at the outbreak of the War of 1812, he was made a brigadier general and commander of the Army of the Northwest. Although Hull's account of Hale's execution was, like Tiffany's, based on secondhand information, Hull first heard of Hale's death the day after his execution, during a flag of truce conference with British Captain John Montresor, who had actually witnessed Hale's hanging. Because Hull got his information so near to the time of the actual event, and from someone who was there, one might assume that his account was inherently more reliable than Consider Tiffany's. But consider this. Hull's account of Hale's death wasn't referenced by anyone until 1799, almost a quarter century after Hale was hanged. And though it was referenced once in 1799, it wasn't published until 49 years after that, as part of a posthumous biography of Hull assembled from manuscripts, which, by the way, have subsequently disappeared, cannot be found, assembled by Hull's daughter and his grandson. In shaping their biography of William Hull, in which Hale's story appeared, Hull's descendants had an agenda no less forceful than Consider Tiffany's, for they were trying to repair Hull's, by then, completely shattered reputation. Hull had fallen into disgrace because during the War of 1812, he had surrendered Detroit to the British without so much as firing a shot. Now, he reasoned publicly at the time that the Americans couldn't in any way overcome the combined force of the British Army and their Indian allies, and that to fight them would have led to havoc along the Michigan frontier. So, he said, he had chosen to take the personally dishonorable course of surrendering to the enemy without a fight to achieve the logical and what he said was virtuous outcome of not needlessly wasting American lives. Well, unfortunately for Hull, his contemporaries, including his fellow officers, didn't see that behavior in that light. Hull was court-martialed for cowardice, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to be shot. Though he was given a reprieve by President James Madison, the disgrace of his surrender dogged him right up to his death in 1825. The biography assembled by his descendants was an all-out effort to redeem Hull's reputation, and the story of Nathan Hale was central to that effort. And to explain why it was so central, I have to tell you a thing about spying in the 18th century that most people don't know. Because of the Hale story, we think of spying, Hale spying as being just inherently this really brave thing to do, to go behind enemy lines and wear civilian clothes and seek out information. Well, in the 18th century, no person of character or reputation would ever think of being a spy, because that wasn't valorous, that wasn't manly. It was a disgraceful thing to do. Except Nathan Hale loved the commander-in-chief, and he loved his country so much that even though he was a Yale graduate and from a good family and his brother was a minister, he said, I don't care if it's disgraceful. My country needs this. This is important. I'm going to do it. So, with that as the background, this is why Hale's story was used by the Hull family to try to help redeem Hull's reputation. By drawing a close and personal parallel between Hale and Hull, the biographers suggested that Hull's surrender of Detroit without a fight, an act that was seen as dishonorable as Hale's spying had been seen, could, like Hale's execution, be seen as intensely patriotic and self-sacrificing if you just viewed it in the appropriate and logical context. Hull had saved many lives. Hale had done a terrible thing for a very good cause. The axes being ground by the Hull family and their version of the Nathan Hale story were no less personal and no less sharp than the ones in the account rendered by Consider Tiffany. And it's naive, I think, to read either Hull's account or Tiffany's account of the capture and execution of Nathan Hale without being fully mindful of the agendas that inform their production. And ultimately, you'll have to decide which one you agree with, or maybe it's a blend of both. You're the boss here. And that's part of what makes the Hale story so interesting and so timeless. The evidence about Hale is, in the final analysis, fragmentary, contradictory, and full of gaps. And because of that, historians who study Nathan Hale have to make choices about whose evidence to believe and how best to account for the lapses in the record about which we know so very little with complete certainty. This has produced accounts of Hale the hero, Hale the incompetent, Hale the naive, and as one of my shock jock undergraduate students confidently said to his Connecticut history course classmates, Hale the idiot. Yet there's one thing upon which virtually all sources about Nathan Hale agree, and which I think should be considered the one incontrovertible point about Hale that makes him truly admirable. At the same time, there's one usually overlooked factor about Hale that explains why he was subjected, and he was, to such harsh and summary justice by the British. I mean, the way they treated him was unconscionable, even as it connects him to 9/11. I want to use the remainder of this talk to discuss those points and bring it together with the 9/11 story. Whether Hale was exposed by Robert Rogers or his own cousin Samuel, whether he immediately admitted his actions when he was arrested or tried to save his skin by lying, whether he said, I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country, or something longer and less memorable, whether he was a good spy or an incompetent spy, whether he was adequately prepared for his mission or sent as a sheep to the wolves, there's one thing about Nathan Hale that his contemporaries, both American and British, and the historians who followed them, have all agreed upon. When the chips were down and it was clear that he would pay the ultimate price for his actions, Nathan Hale acted with courage and composure. He died a good and an honorable death as an American patriot. And for that grace under pressure, Ernest Hemingway's definition of courage, in the service of liberty, Hale is, I believe, entitled to lasting honor as an American hero, and one of the very first. This is especially true given the extraordinarily harsh circumstances surrounding his execution. Nathan Hale wasn't the first spy captured by the British or the Americans, but he was the first one to be executed by either side in the War for Independence. Moreover, he was hanged within hours of his arrest, having been denied the benefit of trial by court-martial required under the English Articles of War. In his final hours on that Sunday morning he died, Hale was denied access to a Bible. And his last letters, one to his commanding officer Thomas Knowlton and the other to his brother Enoch, were opened by the British and they were never delivered. Historians trying to explain this rough justice in the case of Nathan Hale have often attributed it to battlefield pressures by British commanders and to the fact that Hale had both openly confessed to being a spy and was found with incriminating evidence on his person. Both of those arguments are weak. The idea that the British General Howe sentenced Hale to immediate death because he needed to get back to battle is without foundation. Hale was captured during a significant lull in the New York campaign. Firing had stopped a week before Hale's capture after the September 16th Battle of Harlem Heights, and it wouldn't begin again in earnest until the end of October with the Battle of White Plains. And we shouldn't assume that Hale's public confession just abrogated the British Articles of War's requirement that spies, too, be convicted by formal court-martial or not at all. To find what did in fact trigger the inhumane treatment of the condemned Hale, we have to look elsewhere. George Dudley Seymour, he was a kind of a big figure in the history of New Haven and in historical restoration at the beginning of the 20th century. He was perhaps the foremost Hale biographer, and he noted in his biography of Nathan Hale, this is a quote, "When Hale was brought to the artillery park for execution, he must have seen a drifting pall of smoke rising from the great fire then raging in the city. It's to that pall of smoke and that great fire of New York that I believe we have to turn for answers." On the night of Friday, September 21st, 1776, the same evening that Robert Rogers arrested Nathan Hale, a great reddish light appeared just after midnight on the streets of southern Manhattan. The fire that was the great light source started at a tavern near Whitehall. Brisk southerly breezes quickly spread its embers to nearby houses, frames tinder dry after a long, unusually rain-free summer. In minutes, the tavern fire became a conflagration. The fire raged with inconceivable violence, a British officer later reported, and in its destructive progress, it swept away all the buildings between Broad Street and the North River. The North was the Hudson River. As far as King's College, a few only excepted. King's College was Columbia. Long before the main fire reached Trinity Church, that large, ancient, and venerable edifice was in flames, which baffled every effort to suppress them. Now, we'd imagine the Twin Towers, but the steeple of Trinity Church was their Twin Towers. And this is what happened. The steeple, which was 140 feet high, resembled a vast pyramid of fire, exhibiting a most awful and grand spectacle. Several women and children perished in the fire. Their shrieks joined to the roaring of the flames, the crash of falling houses, and the widespread ruin which everywhere appeared, formed a scene of horror great beyond description, which was still heightened by the darkness of the night. As terrible as that fire was, it wasn't unexpected. The question of whether the American army would burn New York rather than turn it over to the British had been as thick as smoke in the air for months. Such fears weren't without substance. From the Americans' perspective, allowing the British to make their winter quarters in a major port town along the seaside, while they were forced to fend for themselves in the frozen countryside, seemed pointless, if not outright foolhardy. Prior to the Continental Army's evacuation of New York, Washington's most trusted advisor, General Nathanael Greene, had urged firing the city as a strategic necessity. 2/3 of the property of New York, he reminded Washington, belongs to the Tories. I would burn the city and the suburbs for the following reasons. One, if the enemy takes the city, we never can recover it without a superior naval force. Two, we'll deprive the enemy of the opportunity of barracking their whole army together. And three, we'll deprive them of a general market. All these advantages would result from the destruction of the city, and not one benefit can arise to us from its preservation. British commanders not only expected that a retreating American army might try to torch New York, they were also certain of which group of soldiers Washington would call on to light that torch. New Englanders, unlike their New York or Pennsylvania counterparts, were strongly in favor of the city's destruction. New Englanders had long viewed New York, and some of us still do, as a kind of commercial Sodom and Gomorrah. They had nothing but contempt for the possibility of letting the city fall under British control. As Nathan Hale's friend Gilbert Saltonstall had written to him months before the Great Fire, I wish New York was either razed to the foundations or strongly garrisoned by the American forces. I greatly fear the virtue of the New Yorkers, whose religion is trade, whose God is gain. So what's different, right? On September 2nd, as the Americans were preparing their evacuation plans, a British officer had written home from Long Island. He wrote this: I've just heard there's been a most dreadful fray in New York. The New Englanders insisted on setting the town on fire and retreating. This was opposed by the New Yorkers, who were joined by the Pennsylvanians, and a battle has been the consequence, in which many lost their lives. Another letter, written 2 days later to a gentleman in London, lent credence to that story. It reported that escapees from the city had informed the British generals that Washington had ordered 3 battalions of New York provincials to leave New York, and that they would be replaced by an equal number of Connecticut troops. But the New York troops, assured that the Connecticutans would burn and destroy all the houses, peremptorily refused to give up the city. Such reports, intriguing as they are, say a lot more about the rumor machines that accompany armies in the field than about Washington's intentions for New York. Not that he hadn't considered burning the city, he most definitely had. On September 2nd, the same day he was supposedly positioning troops to torch New York, Washington had written Congress asking guidance on whether the city should be destroyed. If we should be obliged to abandon the town, ought it to stand as winter quarters for the enemy, he had asked? The alternative, he made clear, was the city's destruction. Congress, reasoning no doubt that if Washington actually torched New York, the British would feel free to literally fight fire with fire in every American city, responded immediately and emphatically. Congress would have special care taken, they told Washington, that no damage be done to the said city by his troops on their leaving it. And for Washington, who embodied his whole life the concept of civilian control of the military, that was it. The city he evacuated 2 weeks later was left intact. Fears of an American plot to torch the city didn't leave with him, though. New York loyalists and their liberating British military leaders continued to worry about Washington's intentions. And so, when the hell on earth swept through the city that Friday night in September, those who fought the fire and those who fled the fire automatically laid the blame to a patriot plot. This produced horrific consequences. Newspaper accounts printed after the blaze had destroyed over 1,000 buildings, between 20 to 25% of New York's total building stock, describe in great detail the retribution mobs extracted from those they thought responsible for setting the flames. The St. James Chronicle of London, calling the fire an atrocious act, reported that one William Smith, an officer in a New England regiment, was taken with a match in his hand and sacrificed on the spot to the fury of the soldiers who were fighting the fire. The Gaines's Mercury, also of London, reported that several persons were discovered with large bundles of matches dipped in melted rosin and brimstone, attempting to set fire to the houses. One White, a carpenter, was observed to cut the leather buckets which were used to carry water to the fire. This provoked the spectators to such a degree that they instantly hung him up. In the war for public opinion, the after reports published in English and Loyalist papers tried to establish conclusively that the Great Fire of New York was indeed an act of arson ordered by the American command. Thus, the persons who called themselves our friends and protectors were the perpetrators of this atrocious deed, which in guilt and villainy is not inferior to the gunpowder plot. Our distress was very great before this, but this disaster has increased it tenfold. Many hundreds of families have lost their all and are reduced from a state of affluence to the lowest ebb of want and wretchedness, destitute of shelter, food, or clothing. Although the truth of the matter can't be determined from existing evidence, most historians who have studied the source of the Great Fire of 1776 have concluded that it was started accidentally and was spread not by arsonists, but by strong south winds blowing across Manhattan that night. As to the supposed patriot arsonists whose names appear in the Tory accounts of the fire, we're left only to speculate, for their names appear only in those newspaper accounts. As to the burning question of whether Nathan Hale's real mission was to torch New York, as William Henry Shelton argued back in 1915, most historians find the idea that Washington would send an arsonist to New York via Connecticut and Long Island hardly credible. Moreover, they reason quite persuasively, I think, that if the British had evidence that Hale actually was an arsonist, they would have trumpeted it both to the enraged and homeless loyalists of New York seeking revenge for their suffering and in the newspaper battle for public opinion. Yet, though Hale wasn't an arsonist, it's to that pall of smoke hanging over New York that we must turn in order to understand the rough justice he received. New York was still smoldering, and the rage of both the army and the people over what they believed was an act of arson was still white hot. Hale, a New England officer, although captured on Long Island as a spy gathering intelligence, nevertheless matched precisely the image of the arsonist both the British generals and the Loyalist citizenry had expected Washington to send to burn their town. Hale might not have been an arsonist, but in the search for a symbol of revenge for arson, he would serve just fine. It is smoldering anger over Washington's presumed use of New England troops to burn New York that explains Hale's being immediately sentenced to death without benefit of court-martial. It's smoldering anger over Washington's presumed use of New England troops to burn New York that explains the refusal to give Hale the comfort of a Bible on that Sunday morning of his death. Its smoldering anger over Washington's presumed use of New England troops to burn New York that explains why the British read and refused to deliver his last letters. And its smoldering anger over Washington's presumed use of New England troops to burn New York that explains one more thing. 4 days after Hale's execution, a British officer wrote a letter from New York to a friend in England describing what had happened to Hale following his execution. "We hanged up a rebel spy the other day," the officer wrote, "and some soldiers got out of a rebel gentleman's garden a painted soldier on a board, and they hung it along with the rebel and wrote upon it, 'General Washington.' And I saw it yesterday beyond headquarters by the roadside." A hanging cardboard cutout soldier named Washington and a New England spy named Nathan Hale. To New Yorkers furious at the burning of their city, that tableau provided a pure message of vengeance and revenge. Whenever we try to visualize Nathan Hale, I suspect most of us imagine him young, handsome, brave, standing on the gallows, uttering his final patriotic words. But if we're to fully understand the circumstances of his execution, we must also see a bloated, distorted body of that same young man hanging from a tree 4 days later, and next to his grotesque form, a hanged cutout of a soldier with the word Washington painted on it. War creates heroes, but it also turns people into hateful, unreasoning, vengeful creatures. And that brings me back to the fire with which this talk began and the days of fear that followed the 9/11 attack. The cruel and inhuman treatment of Nathan Hale by the British as a scapegoat for an enemy they thought they knew but couldn't see is a reminder, as if we needed more reminders, of how easy it is to brand a whole people as evil just because of the acts of a few. And how important it is, even in times of terror, to judge others carefully, cautiously, and with reason. This is a lesson which, like our freedom itself, is a gift from the sacrifice of Nathan Hale. And I thank you for letting me come share it with you. And I thank Consider Tiffany, without whom this talk would not exist. So thank you, Hartland. Thank you, Hartland's one of the founders. So if you have any questions, I've told you everything I know, but I'm good at making stuff up. So let's go. There you go. Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your having me.